Hello everyone and welcome to the Clinical Bacteriology lecture for Module 11. So in this video, we will be discussing the second major group of gram-negative, facultative, anaerobic, and fermentative bacilli, which are your Vibrio, Aeromonas, Plesiomonas, and Campylobacter. So these are also called your miscellaneous enteric pathogens that are usually found on the gastrointestinal tracts of humans or their hosts, but are different from your family Enterobacteriaceae. Here are the learning objectives for this module. So we have to identify each bacteria under the family and also to describe their colony morphology and microscopic characteristics, as well as associate some diseases that they can cause, and 4 and 5 to identify and isolate them using our biochemical tests and procedures. Here is the topic outline. So the asynchronous discussion for this particular module will be divided into 2 videos. So the first video, or video lecture 1, we will be talking about the general characteristics and clinical manifestation of these organisms. So here we will be talking about the diseases, the signs and symptoms, and some important facts that might be helpful in identifying them. Next video, since our Module 11 do not have any counterpart or laboratory counterpart, we will also be including here in the lecture the laboratory isolation and identification of these organisms. So here we'll be talking about the biochemical tests and procedures that might be helpful in identifying them. Okay, so let's start. Here are the general characteristics of the miscellaneous enteric pathogens. So again, when we say enteric, usually their target location would be the gastrointestinal tract of their host. So on this module, we have 4 types of genera that we will be discussing. The first one is the Vibrio. Next, we have Campylobacter. Next, we have your Aeromonas. And lastly, we have your Plesiomonas. So I have an acronym here. We have the VCAP, okay? So that stands to the first letter of their name, para di makalimutan. So VCAP are usually facultative anaerobes, just like your family Enterobacteriaceae. They are also gram-negative bacilli, just like the previous family, and are also glucose fermenter. So these 3 characteristics are the same with the family Enterobacteriaceae. The only thing that differs from that they differ from the family Enterobacteriaceae is the oxidase test. For family Enterobacteriaceae, they are oxidase. Can you recall on module 10? They are oxidase negative. But for our miscellaneous enteric pathogens such as your VCAP, they are positive. So we will be discussing the oxidase test later on your laboratory part. So most of the diseases that are caused by your VCAP are infectious diarrhea. Again, they are enteric, no? So kung kahit na, for example, nag-quiz kayo and hindi mo alam yung disease na kinakos niya, pero alam mo na enteric siya, most of the time, diarrhea yan, okay? Pero wag yung gagayahin si sir. So, pag hindi mo na lang talaga alam. But most of the time, diarrhea or any kind of diseases that is related through the gastrointestinal tract. Okay, so let's start with the first family under VCAP. So we have your family VIBRIONACEAE. Usually, this family contains 10 genera that includes our genus Vibrio. So most of the time, bacteria that under this family are found usually on aquatic environments such as lakes, rivers, and even saltwater or seawater, So they can also tolerate high salt content of the water. So they can also thrive on that particular environment. They're also temperature sensitive, which means at least 20 degrees or more yung temperature na dapat na environment nila. So that is why yung kanilang diseases and infections that they cause have more cases during summer months than in winter months. So the most common disease that they cause, usually, specifically the Vibrio cholerae species, is the cholera, okay? This is a pandemic disease that causes watery stool and diarrhea to their hosts or to the infected patients. So, hindi lang cholera yung kinakos ng family or the bacteria under this family. They can also cause mild gastroenteritis, which is the inflammation of our gastrointestinal tract, and simple wound infection until to necrotizing fasciitis. So this is very serious kasi this is the flesh-eating bacteria, okay? So, check natin sino nga ba yung nagko-cause nitong particular disease. They can also cause fatal septicemia if untreated. So we have a lot of species under the genus Vibrio, but we will be focusing our attention to the 4 most common isolated organisms. So we have your Vibrio cholerae, which is the most common Vibrio under this genus. So this is the one that causes cholera and usually is divided into a lot of serogroups and biotypes. So for serogroups, we have your serogroup O1, serogroup O139, and the non-O1 serogroup. So later on, we will be differentiating these 3 types of serogroups for Vibrio cholerae. Next, we have the Vibrio parahaemolyticus. Next, we have the Vibrio vulnificus and the Vibrio alginolyticus. So, looking at here on our table for clinical infections associated with the Vibrio species, let's look at Vibrio cholerae O1 and Vibrio cholerae O139. These 2 are the causative agent of your cholera. For Vibrio cholerae non-O1, usually gastroenteritis, septicemia, brain abscess, or other extraintestinal infection. For Vibrio parahaemolyticus, most of the time, yung kanilang disease would be gastroenteritis as well, and extraintestinal infections such as wound infections. For vulnificus and alginolyticus, ang pinaka-common sa kanila would be septicemia or bacteremia, okay? They can also be common for wound infection as well. So, at least man lang dito, ma-memorize natin hanggang kay alginolyticus, yung mga diseases nila. Okay? So, ito yung sinasabi ko for necrotizing fasciitis, the Photobacterium damsilae. So, usually, this is very common and quite rare to happen, but this is the bacterium that causes the necrotizing fasciitis. So, hindi lang siya, no? We have a lot of bacteria that causes this particular wound infection. So, one of them is Photobacterium damsilae. So now let's go to the antigenic structures of the genus Vibrio. So there is not much knowledge or experimentation regarding these particular structures, but just like your family Enterobacteriaceae, they also contain 2 types of antigen. So the first one, we have the flagellar H antigen, and the second one is the somatic O antigen. So normally, H and O antigens are used by scientists to determine the serotypes of a particular genus or specifically a particular bacterium. So with this, the H and O antigen are actually used to test if a particular genus has different types of species. So paano nga ba ito? So H and O antigen are usually tested by serological tests. A good example of your serological test is the Widal test, WIDAL, okay? Widal test is used to determine or measure the antibodies against the H and O antigen. So, normally kasi, if a particular species, like for example, this Vibrio cholerae, so meron siyang H antigen, so that means our body, if exposed to Vibrio cholerae, will produce antibodies against H antigen. So with this, the antibodies that are present on our blood is measured by the Widal test. So malalaman natin yung specific species or specific classification nung isang family or genus based on these types of serological testing. So this is also the same with the O antigen. So just nice to know, additional for H antigen, this is called the flagellar antigen because this is usually found and detected on the flagella of a particular bacterium, while the somatic antigen is usually found on the lipopolysaccharide cell wall of our bacterium. So for H antigen, the flagellar antigen, many Vibrios share a single heat labile flagellar antigen, but the most common ones are the Vibrio cholerae and Vibrio parahaemolyticus. Okay, so they contain H antigen on their particular flagella. While the somatic antigen, we have one, the Vibrio cholerae O1. So this is a subtype of Vibrio cholerae, which means that it can be divided into different serotypes due to the fact that it was ano bang tawag dito, identified by the Widal test. Okay? So, nagkaroon siya ng different types of serotypes. Okay? So, we have the Ogawa AB, Inaba AC, and the Hikojima ABC. So, under Vibrio, we have Vibrio cholerae. Under Vibrio cholerae, we have Vibrio cholerae 01. Under Vibrio cholerae 01, we have Ogawa, Inaba, and Hikojima. Okay? Kaya pa? Ayan. So, later on, we will show you the summary. Okay? So let's talk about the clinical manifestations of Vibrio cholerae. So Vibrio cholerae again is the causative agent of your pandemic cholera. So usually cholera is an acute diarrheal disease. So acute siya because the symptoms can be present on the patient or the infected person in a matter of hours. So this is a diarrheal disease that is spread mainly through contaminated water. Pero hindi lang sa water, they can also be acquired through improperly preserved food such as seafood and unpreserved meat. So most of the time for cholera, patient or infected people manifest in acute cases as severe gastroenteritis. So this is the inflammation of our gastrointestinal tract and accompanied by vomiting and followed by diarrhea. So the hallmark of this particular disease is the rice watery stool. So this is due to the fact that rapid fluid and electrolyte loss is present on the patient. So with this, if there is particular rapid fluid and electrolyte loss, that leads to dehydration to the patient. And if there is no intervention happened on the part of the patient, this patient may lead to hypovolemic shock due to low blood pressure and may cause metabolic acidosis and death in a matter of hours. So this hallmark of series of symptoms, deadly symptoms usually, is the result of a powerful enterotoxin known as what we call cholera toxin or choleragen. So this is present on our Vibrio cholerae that causes these kinds of symptoms to the patient. So normally this toxin attacks the intestinal or gastrointestinal tract of the person and causes this sequela of symptoms. Usually for Vibrio cholerae, the Vibrio cholerae 01 subgroup and the Vibrio cholerae 0139 are the one that causes this particular disease. So now let's go to the biotypes of Vibrio cholerae, specifically the biotypes of Vibrio cholerae 01. So Vibrio cholerae 01 is a strain of the Vibrio cholerae. Sino na nga ba yung dalawa? So we have the 01. Next, ano yung isa? 0139. And lastly, the non-01. So we have three subunit or subgroups or strains of Vibrio cholerae, and 01 has a lot of cases of cholera among the three. So normally kapag madami siyang nai-infect na tao, so more chances of it being studied or being tested. So Vibrio cholerae has biotypes and serotypes as well. For biotypes, we have the classical and the L-Tor biotype. So these both of these usually causes cholera, but the L-Tor biotype has been the predominant biogroup in the last two pandemics of cholera. So nag-evolve na yung ating Vibrio. Okay? So for biotypes, again, classical and L-Tor. Sa serotypes, we already discussed this. It has the Ogawa, Inaba, and Hikojima. So for biotype, we are actually testing the organism based on their physiological characteristic. While for serological or serotypes, we are testing the organisms kung may species pa siya or there is differentiation based on the serological test that they have done to that particular organism. Here is the summary for Vibrio cholerae. So it has strains of 01, 0139, and the non-O. So among the three, 01 and 0139 are the causative agents of pandemic cholera. So Vibrio cholerae 01 is the most established one, which has biotypes of classical and L-Tor types. So L-Tor is now the most common or prevalent biotype that causes the pandemic cholera. since 1996, and this Vibrio cholerae 01 also has serotypes such as the Ogawa AB, Inaba AC, and Hikojima ABC. So again, for 01 and 0139, they are the causes of pandemic cholera. So pakipalit to, pandemic yun eh. So normally, for non-O strain of Vibrio cholerae, strains that phenotypically resemble this particular genus but fail to agglutinate in O1 antisera are referred to as Vibrio cholerae non-O1. Another summary for the classification of your serotypes and biotypes under Vibrio cholerae. So for serological typing, we have three types: the non-O1 and the non-O139, the O139, and the classic O1, which has the more cases of cholera. So under your O1 serotype, we have further serotypes, which is the Ogawa, Inaba, and Hikojima. So for Ogawa, their antigen has A and B. For Inaba, we have the A and C antigen. For Hikojima, we have the A, B, and C antigens. So for biotypes, we have two types. We have the O1 classical and the O1 LTOR. For O1 classical, this is the past cholera or the past causative agent of cholera, and the LTOR is the one that causes more cases since 1996. This is also more prevalent in India, the LTOR biotype. So the next species under your Vibrio is the Vibrio parahaemolyticus. So this species was first recognized as a pathogen in Japan when it was the cause of a large food poisoning outbreak. Even today, it was the primary cause of the so-called summer diarrhea in Japan. So normally, for patient infected with this particular organism, they have watery diarrhea, moderate cramps or vomiting, and sometimes fever. So symptoms begin at around 24 to 48 hours after ingestion of contaminated seafood. So another thing for your Vibrio parahaemolyticus, this is the second most common Vibrio species that can cause gastroenteritis after Vibrio cholerae. The specific serotype for this particular parahaemolyticus that can cause the gastroenteritis is the Vibrio parahaemolyticus serotype O3K6. Normally, for this particular organism, it is acquired through eating raw fish or oysters and other marine animals. For extraintestinal infections such as wound infection, ear or eye infection, they are usually acquired when swimming or exposing wound or open wounds on these infected bodies of water. So for gastroenteritis caused by Vibrio parahaemolyticus, this is usually self-limited and with enough intervention may resolve on its own. So next is the Kanagawa phenomenon. So I will be explaining this in detail on our laboratory part on video part 2. So just a parang brief eye view or bird's eye view rather. The Kanagawa phenomenon is the hemolysis of our red blood cell on blood agar plate, or specifically the Wagatsuma agar. So on laboratory, we will be explaining this phenomenon. So next species under your Vibrio is the Vibrio vulnificus. So this is usually found on the bodies of water of Atlantic, Gulf, and Pacific coast of North America. So this produces the second most serious types of infection after cholera, and that would be the primary septicemia and wound infection. So for primary septicemia, this is thought to occur through the gastrointestinal route after consumption of shellfish, especially raw oysters. So patient with liver dysfunction and syndromes that result in increased serum iron levels may be predisposed to this particular scenario or your primary septicemia. For wound infection, patient infected with Vibrio vulnificus have wound infections that appear as cellulitis. And most of the time, yung reason why they get this particular wound infection is through traumatic aquatic wound. So exposure of fresh wound to these infected bodies of water, just like your Vibrio parahaemolyticus. So there are cases that this particular wound infection may progress to cellulitis and even worse, necrotizing fasciitis. So, septicemia occurred through the gastrointestinal route after consumption of shellfish, especially raw oysters. So, ito yung sinabi ko kanina. And, yun nga, for wound infection, this is due to traumatic aquatic wound. So, lastly, on your Vibrio species, we have the Vibrio alginolyticus. So, this is the least pathogenic among your Vibrios, and it is the least isolated organism. That is why there is not much knowledge regarding this particular organism, specifically sa laboratory part. So, this is thought to be a marine organism and a strict halophile, which requires 1% sodium chloride or salt, but can able to tolerate up to 10% sodium chloride. So, yung extraintestinal infection niya may appear or may range to eye and ear infection, wound, and even infect some burn infections. So, the occupational hazard or the people who are predisposed to this particular organism are those who are related or having jobs that are related to water, such as fishermen and sailors. So now we're done with the Vibrios. So let's go with the second miscellaneous enteric pathogens, and that would be the Campylobacteriaceae and Helicobacteriaceae. So for this module, we will be dealing only with organisms under your Campylobacter and Campylobacter-like species such as your Helicobacter. So these types of organisms are zoonotic in nature. So they are primary pathogens of our animals such as cattle, pigs, sheep, and other farm animals, and sometimes may also infect your pets such as dogs and cats. Human infections are not well established, but for Campylobacter jejuni, this is the leading cause of bacterial gastroenteritis to humans. The common cause of or common route of mode of transmission for these particular organisms is direct contact with animals and handling infected pets. There are some cases also where you can acquire these particular organisms to humans and are usually in sexually transmitted mode. So here is the complete list of the Campylobacter species and Campylobacter-like organisms and their associated diseases. So it is very important to get familiarized with their diseases and species that causes this type of diseases so that we can identify them or differentiate them based on the patient's symptoms of disease. So for our Campylobacter species, we need to focus on Campylobacter jejuni and Campylobacter fetus subspecies fetus. So for jejuni, this is the most common cause of bacterial diarrhea or gastroenteritis worldwide. For Campylobacter fetus subspecies fetus, this causes bacteremia in immunocompromised patients such as people living with AIDS and other immunocompromised individuals. So for mostly jejuni and fetus yung pinaka-common, but of course, it is very important for us to know the other specific organisms. For Helicobacter pylori, this is the common cause of duodenal ulcer and type B gastritis on patient. So this is possible risk factor in gastric carcinoma as well. So again, here are the organisms under Campylobacter that are more clinically significant. So lahat nito, especially your Campylobacter jejuni. So aside from bacterial diarrhea or gastroenteritis, your Campylobacter jejuni is also associated with Guillain-Barré syndrome or GBS. So strongly evidence suggests that Campylobacter infection plays a role in this particular autoimmune disorder. So this autoimmune disorder is characterized by an acute paralysis due to the damage to the peripheral nervous system. Many patients with GBS or Guillain-Barré syndrome test positive for antibodies to Campylobacter with an estimated of 1 in 1,000 individuals diagnosed following a Campylobacter infection. It is believed that antibodies produced during a Campylobacter infection bind to gangliocyte, which is found on the peripheral nerves of our brain, and cross-reacts with these nerve cells in an autoimmune response. So they can be the responsible cause where there is debilitating nerve disorder. So nagkakaroon ng paralysis on half of the patient's body. Next, let's go to the infection that are caused by your family Helicobacteriaceae. Specifically, here are all the clinically significant species under this family, and the most common one is the Helicobacter pylori. So now let's talk about the clinical manifestation of Helicobacter pylori. So this is the common cause of gastritis infection, specifically the type B gastritis. So this bacterial infection causes the inflammation of the stomach lining, leading to chronic gastritis. So gastritis caused by this infection is lifelong and often one of the most serious forms of chronic gastritis because it leads to further complication such as peptic ulcer. So there are speculation kasi that if a particular Helicobacter pylori infection or gastritis is not treated, it may result to chronic gastritis and become an important risk factor for gastric carcinoma or cancer. So here are the other types of gastritis. So type A, the causative agent is our immune system. So it's an autoimmune disease where our own immune system attacks the stomach lining of our stomach. So symptoms may appear as abdominal ache or indigestion. For type B, this is caused by H. pylori. So it's a bacterial infection and normally mas grabe yung symptoms na kinokos niya. So stomach ache, indigestion, vomiting, and diarrhea. For type C, this is reactive gastritis and it is usually caused by unhealthy lifestyle and diet and usually may present as symptoms of bloody stool, diarrhea, indigestion, and heartburn. So the next genus for the miscellaneous enteric pathogens are your Aeromonas. So just like your Vibrio, they are marine organism and considered as enteric pathogens. So they are acquired through eating produce such as animal meat products. So they are also just like your Vibrio, have seasonal pattern which prefer warmer months. For intestinal infection, they varies from different types of species. So for your Aeromonas caviae, it is more common for gastrointestinal infection on neonates and children, while for your Aeromonas hydrophilia and Aeromonas veroni and their viobars, more on diarrhea and as well as hemolytic uremic syndrome. So hemolytic uremic syndrome is a condition that can occur when the small blood vessels in your kidneys become damaged and inflamed. So this damage can cause clots to form in the vessels. So the clots clog the filtering system in the kidneys and lead to kidney failure, which could be life-threatening. So your genus Aeromonas, the species under this particular genus, may also cause extraintestinal infection. So the infection may range to septicemia or presence of bacteria in the blood and also wound infection. So they can also cause a lot of inflammation to several sites of the body. So usually the particular extraintestinal infection can be acquired with the recent traumatic aquatic exposure. So again, just like the other species before this particular genus, so exposure of fresh wound on the infected body of water may cause extraintestinal infection. So the most common species that can cause this extraintestinal infection are your species Aeromonas hydrophilia, subspecies hydrophilia, and Aeromonas dachensis. Although very rare yung kanilang infection to humans, your Aeromonas can cause a very serious type of sepsis, which is your Aeromonad sepsis, which is the presence of bacteria in the blood, which is one of the most invasive type of infection, and similarly has a strong association with the species of Aeromonas veroni biovar sobria, Aeromonas jandiae, and Aeromonas hydrophilia. So normally, patient or people who have immunocompromised states have higher risk factors to this particular disease. Also, patients with history of liver disease, hematological malignancies or bone marrow disorders, and also hepatobiliary disorder are also risk factors in having a serious type of septicemia called your Aeromonad sepsis. Normally, for patient infected with this disease, they may experience nausea, vomiting, and abdominal pain. Pero sometimes, worse, they can also lead to respiratory failure or even death. So yung according sa mga sources, the mortality rate of your Aeromonad sepsis is usually at 46%. So it's quite high. So last genus under your miscellaneous enteric pathogen is the genus Plesiomonas. So this is now under the family Enterobacteriaceae, but according sa sources and other textbook, it is not much detailed or walang masyadong information regarding this genus. So it is only considered having one type of species, and that is the Plesiomonas shigelloides. Taxonomically, it is related to Proteus species, so parehas sila ng growth with this on culture medium. And serologically, they can be related to Shigella sonei. They can also be found on fresh water such as your Vibrio and estuarine waters. So here are all the pertinent information regarding Plesiomonas shigelloides. So this is not from the book, this is from an online source. So for your laboratory part, we will be discussing this on the video lecture 2. So let's start with the habitat. Again, for your Plesiomonas, they are found on fresh water or brackish water and prefer warmer months. So for infection, since they are again enteric, they can cause diarrhea, which is mild self-limiting watery diarrhea. So this is the most common infection that we can get for Plesiomonas. There are some cases that can cause severe bloody diarrhea, which is also known as dysenteric colitis, and chronic diarrhea, which may last for more than 14 days duration. So the risk factor is again consumption of undercooked seafood such as shellfish. Sometimes you can also be predisposed if you travel to Southeast Asia or you have HIV, and especially children. Extraintestinal infection is the same with your Aeromonas. They may cause sepsis and meningitis and other types of inflammation in the several areas of our body. The risk factor for extraintestinal infection is old age, underlying biliary disease or liver disease, immunocompromise, blood dyscrasia, and other types of hematological disease such as sickle cell disease and thalassemia. So these are all blood disorders. So most cases are associated with the consumption again of raw or poorly prepared seafood. So the virulence factor of this particular organism is not much detailed or explained, but we have your cytotoxic hemolysin, iron acquisition system, and lipopolysaccharide. So the treatment, or punta muna tayo sa incubation. So after being infected with Plesiomonas, you usually show symptoms at around 1 to 2 days. So the treatment is usually self-limiting and supportive treatment is sufficient. So drinking of water and proper hygiene. Severe or systemic infection may need antibiotic therapy such as using of azithromycin, ciprofloxacin, and third-generation cephalosporin or carbapenems. So that ends our video lecture 1. So head over to lecture 2, which will be focused on laboratory diagnosis of these particular organisms.